people on the call, which is a great number because that is as many members as we have at CUSP, the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners. So now is as good time as any to get started. So welcome to a cracking webinar on integrating equity into program. So I will ask you to put yourself on mute unless you have to ask a question, and there will be room for that. So today's presentation is brought to you by CUSP. My name is Abi. I am the new program manager for the LEAP project, which is working with 6 cities across Canada and supporting them as they integrate equity into their programs. Today's presentation is broken into more or less 3 chunks. The first chunk is about 20 minutes. Farah Anderson from Cadmus is going to give us a rundown of the context, a background and overview of both the project as well as the specific webinar integrating equity into EV. And then we have Philip Kay, who will be giving us a few examples of what other cities have done in integrating equity into EV strategies. And then finally, we have Nadine from the City of Toronto, who's been spending some time with us and talking to us about the work that they have done with the City of Toronto and putting some of this to action. There's room for discussion in between each of these segments about it. So we're hoping to get everyone out of here in an hour and a half from now. This webinar is also being recorded. So if you need to send this, if you wanted your colleagues to be here and they're not here, if you want to send this to a friend, I will, at the end of this call, I will put together a little video and send it out. Now, bear in mind, feel free to have a very candid discussion. The discussion segments will be cut out from the final video. The video will only focus on the presentation aspects of it. So we have about 22 people on the call. I might have to put folks on mute, and I'll unmute. Yeah, so if you're on a phone, I will ask you that you mute yourself because it might be a little difficult for the rest of us to hear. Otherwise, I'm afraid I might have to crack the whip and mute all of us, and we don't want that. So please put yourself on mute if you're on call, and let's get this started. So the first segment is brought to you.
Abby.
Yes, ma'am.
Abby, it's Allison here. I'm just noticing because I'm trying to mute them. It is somebody who is on the phone, not using the computer audio. So if you're using a old school phone, put yourself on mute because I can't mute you. Thank you. You just did it. Thanks very much, caller number 5.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you. So I'm going to pass the reins on to Farah, and I will be moving the slides forward.
Great, yeah, thanks, Abhi. Hi all, it's Farah Anderson from Cadmus. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, but Abhi, I realized before we fully passed over to me, if you wanted to do a quick intro on who we are for CUSP, that would be great, and then I'll sort of fully take over from there.
Sounds good. So, at CUSP, we are, like I said before, supporting a group of Canadian cities about, specifically in the context of this project, 6 cities who are working to build in equity in their renewable energy transition. So, cities starting from the west, Surrey, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Ottawa might be missing one, I think. But so the leaders of this project, it's a multi-city collaborative initiative, and we've been working on 3 efforts. One is taking a equity and inclusion approach, and the second is developing a set of tools, and the third is sharing best practices. And Cadmus has been we've leaned on Cadmus heavily on some aspects of this project, specifically around developing the guidebook to equity clean energy program. And if you haven't seen it before, it's available on our website. It's really a step-by-step process that cities can go through in thinking and incorporating equity into the clean energy program design. And Cadmus has really been a great partner with us on this, and this, especially in delivering webinars like this. So I will pass it on now back to Farah, who will take us forward.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Abhi. So hi all, as mentioned, I'm Farah Anderson. I'm an associate at Cadmus. I'm joined by my colleague, Philip Kraychek, a senior associate here at Cadmus. And just really briefly, as some of you are familiar, our team provides a variety of technical and strategic support to cities on renewable energy and other aspects of climate mitigation and resilience. One of those aspects is centering equity. So most relevant to this presentation, this webinar actually builds on content that we developed for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network Guidebook on Equitable Clean Energy Program Design for Local Governments and Partners. It is publicly available, and so you may hear us make reference to the guidebook steps as we go through, so just wanted to mention that. As Abhi noted, today's webinar is focused on integrating equity into city clean energy, particularly electric vehicle programs. And so we'll focus on some key framing concepts and then examples before turning it over to Nadine at the City of Toronto. In terms of framing concepts, one of the key ones we wanted to start with here is really, what do we mean by equity? And so some of this has been covered in prior resources that you've received, other webinars, so I'll just touch on it very briefly. In terms of equity, there's really kind of three aspects that we focus on. The USDN definition of equity includes these three. The first is procedural, which is really around ensuring that processes are fair and inclusive. So it's really that inclusion element. The second is distributional. So this is really around ensuring that resources or benefits and burdens of a policy or program are distributed fairly, particularly prioritizing those with the highest need first. So this is often characterized around access. Next is structural. In some cases could be intergenerational. And what we think of here is really around across time, right? Correcting for past harms that have occurred for communities and preventing future negative consequences, really focusing on institutionalizing accountability and decision-making structures that can actually promote and sustain positive outcomes. Turning to the next slide of why equity matters in the context of clean energy. So next slide. This is around really thinking about, why does equity matter in the context of clean energy? And we'll start with just a very initial framing, which is that really, essentially the energy, well, I guess I should back up and talk about the energy transformation, sorry. Was a little delayed there with the slide turnover. So in terms of the energy transformation, what do we mean? This is really system-wide change. So we're talking about change at the grid level, at the household level, in our transportation, which is where we're focused on today, and across our communities. So the deployment of these technologies is growing, but not really evenly across populations. Low and moderate income households, immigrants, and indigenous communities don't often receive their equitable share of benefits. And they're also more likely to be overburdened by harms caused from fossil fuel extraction and use. And so we have an opportunity here to really think about the fact that we have a situation to really actually propel forward using clean energy as a solution and actually meet climate goals, lower the energy burden, provide a healthier environment, and create local jobs. And I didn't really get into depth here, but on the left you have some statistics around sort of the number of Canadians and sort of the energy burden in the US and Canada. So that's there for reference, that has been touched on before. So to move forward in terms of designing the program and really centering equity, we're thinking about here one really key concept we wanted to start with is the idea of targeted universalism. Targeted universalism, so let's unpack this a little bit with each part of the phrase. Targeted, an example of something targeted would be an income qualified program. So you only get the benefit if you meet a certain targeted income criteria. Versus a universal program would be something that everyone receives frequently equally. Targeted universalism, bringing those two together, really means setting a universal goal. So designing a program that targets support to those who need that support the most to achieve that universal goal. So a couple of examples, one first outside of our realm of focus, and then we'll go inside our realm of focus. So outside of our realm of focus, right, you might be setting a goal to achieve a reading level for students, right? So everyone in a given community, we want everyone in that community to achieve a particular grade level of reading level. And then you target resources to support those that might have the most trouble reaching that goal based on structural issues. In the example of what we might be talking about today, it could be something like saying, we want the whole community to have access to a clean energy powered commute that takes under 30 minutes. That would be a universal goal. I'm not saying it's the right goal for every city, but right, that's an example of a type of goal. And then you would target support towards those with maybe the longest commute times, the dirtiest commutes, those types of things. So really the concept here is designing a program for those that are most marginalized. And we'll talk more about some of the other steps that are listed at the bottom of this slide as we get into the further content. So the next slide really highlights the other framing that we wanted to have here. I'm not going to talk through each of these, but the guidebook that I'd referred to at the outset that is publicly available outlines these 12 key design principles for equitable clean energy programs. And we really want to encourage cities to come back to these at every stage in the process. This is really sort of the driving framework behind everything else, and we really encourage you to come back to these. So without talking through each of these, because as I mentioned, they are available elsewhere, did want to at least just provide you a little bit of a flavor for what it could look like to apply a couple of these to a clean energy program, particularly in the electric vehicle context. So one is on the left middle row, one is recognized structural racism. So thinking about, for instance, where do people live? Where people live is frankly often in North America tied to certain histories where there may have been structural racism. So in the US, there's a history of redlining in which certain communities were not able to pursue living in certain areas. They were literally redlined through the financial services system and other means. And so that then has ramifications, fast forward to today, for where communities live and what transportation options connect them to other places that they might need to go. So being aware of what structural racism looks like in your city landscape is really key to starting off on the right foot and designing an equitable program. Another one to just touch on briefly is integrate with other services. Thinking about here, there's a lot of activation energy to get someone over the barriers to adopt an electric vehicle, right? There's segments of communities where people are challenged to buy cars in general, and these segments might have especially high barriers when you think about electric vehicle adoption. So just one example without getting into the nitty-gritty of the program, but Clean Cars for All in California operates in a way that it actually trains contacts at car dealerships to ensure that they're trained on how to process clean energy for Clean Cars for All grants. So again, the actual program details are less important in this specific example than the fact that what they're doing is ensuring that places that people are already going, that their potential participants are already going, are connected in to their program and making it easier and an overall connected process. Those are just a couple of examples for how to think about applying these principles. I'll let us keep diving into the stages of program design. Since I've referenced the guidebook a couple of times, we did just want to orient you to where we are in this process, kind of where our content centers. In an equitable program design process, there's really a lot of stages, not all of which we're focused on today. We're really focusing on program structure, but there are steps before and steps afterwards, and that's really what this diagram here intends to communicate. Additionally, while we tried to lay this out in a bit of a step change format here, the other kind of point is that this is iterative and that this really involves a long-term commitment with accountability, and that's kind of what that loop is intending to communicate there. So that being said, we're really focusing here on structuring the program. Turning to structuring the program, even before getting into all the program details, we did just want to mention, and we'll come back to this, that building an electric vehicles program is a conscious choice. So this guidebook that we're referring to, and kind of our general stance from doing this work, is that local governments and their partners should pick clean energy technologies that best align with their community's needs and with their goals and commercially available options. So here, for the sake of providing a targeted webinar to you all, we've obviously honed in on electric vehicles, but you'll notice that a lot of the points and questions that we raise really focus on unpacking what the community's goals are, which may direct a city to a technology solution other than electric vehicles. And we'll come back to that point. So turning to the context, a couple of points on the context. First, talking about costs. Upfront costs of electric vehicles can be greater than conventional vehicles. The stack is shrinking. Electric vehicles are likely to be less costly to operate and maintain. I think some studies have shown that running an electric vehicle costs less than half as much to operate a gas-powered vehicle. Obviously, that depends on gas and electric rates locally and the type of car driven, but that's just some framing there. And then in terms of city level and beyond, it really is important to think about the infrastructure and what that requires of cities, so such as public charging stations being a pretty key contextual factor in ensuring that electric vehicles can be utilized and that they're accessible to all parts of the communities you want to serve. I'd say taking a targeted universalist approach to equitable electric vehicle program design, a city might consider stationing public charging stations at or near affordable housing residences, for example, or other key areas of the community that the targeted group tends to frequent, just as a flavor again. On the next slide, looking at economic impacts and potential other types of impacts. In terms of job creation, this tends to be one where in the clean energy community we can sometimes take for granted that job creation is always a good thing, and that can, on average, arguably be true. But one thing we really want to think about in equitable program design is how electric vehicle investment can have both positive and negative implications in the immediate term for job opportunities and job training, right? So there might be more or less of certain types of jobs as electric vehicle adoption grows. It's not just that net jobs, but really what the breakdown is among, say, electricians versus auto mechanics, for example, who might come from different sorts of demographic backgrounds. And we'll come back to a lot of these concepts in the examples. On the front around impacts for low-income communities of color, just again for a flavor, target communities might be disproportionately exposed to things like tailpipe emissions from traffic. And so the air quality and health benefits of electric vehicles can have a potentially disproportionate impact in low and moderate income communities of color, particularly in the cases of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So bearing all that context in mind, there are 5 key components on the next slide to establishing program structure. So these are outlined here. We will talk through each of them in a bit more detail. So refining sustainability and equity goals, considering the contextual factors, some of which we just touched on, defining program eligibility, determining a program administrator, and then recruiting key partners. On refining sustainability and equity goals, there's really, it might seem obvious, but being clear about what your equity goals are is a pretty critical step to ensuring you can actually achieve that goal. And then being aware of the context that you're operating in is also really critical to ensuring that you can meet the needs of the underserved communities where you are. So circling back to what we touched on, now that we're talking more explicitly about goals, on that thought that local governments and their partners can design electric vehicle programs in a way that aligns technology with the community needs, we can observe that in addition to electric vehicles, there's other types of electric transportation that might better serve a given community depending on its goals, right? So I wanted to give you an example here. If air quality centers in the community's equity focus, then perhaps light-duty electric vehicles would not be the first solution, since light-duty vehicles don't tend to contribute as heavily to air pollution. So I want to give you a flavor of that, and then we will unpack some of these other factors around context, utility, geographic, economic in a moment here. on defining the goals, one thing to think about is, what do you mean by equity? So in terms of equity, there are a couple different ways to sort of think about this. One is just, how has the city defined equity in the past? Is there an existing municipal equity policy lens that the program can build off of or build towards? And if not, can you look for similar concepts in other city policies or strategies around equity, human rights, social justice, or poverty reduction, right? So there are places to start. It's best for a number of reasons not to feel like you're starting from scratch there. And then what the program goals are, really how are equity and sustainability, again, already defined in existing documents or existing plans, city council strategic plan priorities, et cetera, climate plans, poverty reduction plans. There's a lot of options there. And thinking about how program goals can align with the established goals of intended beneficiaries, right? So in getting people on board for these, what is it that the community is already excited about? Is it extending the reach of public transit, increasing access to personal vehicles? Like, if these are already articulated somewhere, particularly by underserved communities, that's really something to latch onto and really build on, and allows communities to feel like you're actually listening to them already. So finally, how would a program contribute to a vision of a more equitable future? This is, again, thinking about both short and long term, right? So are you thinking of establishing a pilot program? Is this the beginning of a longer program? And then finally, throughout, we have a whole other section on the guidebook that we're not focusing on today, but when you're thinking of defining goals or refining goals, being really mindful of structural barriers to participation, right? So whose voices are even being heard and who's even in the conversation for defining these goals, and ensuring that where and when these types of conversations are being held are as accessible as possible. So that's around defining the goals. As we turn to thinking about context, there's a couple of factors that we have here: geographic, economic, and policy, and then utility. So in terms of geographic, what is some of the questions? Oh, and I should have said on the last slide, actually, I won't talk through each of these questions, but really the questions that are on these slides sort of are laid out this way around each of the key steps. These questions are all here for your reference and will be here, as well as in related resources that Api and Allison will sort of make available to everyone following the call. So coming back to geographic context, things like, what is the urban-rural composition? What is the composition of the housing stock? What neighborhoods have the longest commutes? What's the existing EV infrastructure look like? These are all important to consider, because you might, for example, think about in your own context how that can come to fruition. So an EV car sharing program designed for a rural or less dense community would look very different from an urban EV car sharing program, for example. On economic and policy context, this is really thinking about for whom electric vehicles are most and least viable. As you think about, most adopters so far of electric vehicles to date have largely been single-family households. So thinking about how to incorporate multi-unit residential buildings and the types of additional challenges that there might be there in terms of mixed incentives between tenants and landlords. And then thinking about at a broader economic policy level, right, as the city and regional economic development agendas are probably pursuing further economic development in many instances, that can have strong implications for long-term access to EV infrastructure. If an area of a city gentrifies, that can result in relocation of target populations and really be shifting who is then served by the EV infrastructure that might be put in. Finally, on utility regulatory context, a couple of points here, noting that maybe there might be a little bit more of a US-based framework here, but I think it does have some relevance. So thinking about the type of utility that it serves, so in the US, big considerations are around whether the utility has the authority to rate-base EV charging, as an example, right? And the types of flexibility that could be offered to pursue that or other ends. A municipal utility in the US tends to have more flexibility in these regards, versus on the investor-owned and regulated utility side, the types of things to think about include, what have public utility commissions done or ordered related to equity. So in California, for instance, where there are relatively a lot of electric vehicle programs approved, there's actually a requirement in many cases that a level of investment is made in the program that is targeted towards low-income areas. And so these are, again, all important contextual factors to be aware of in designing your program. In terms of defining program eligibility, on the next slide, there's, again, a few key considerations to think about. And I'd really invite us back to that concept of targeted universalism. Because program eligibility, sometimes our default is to really think about income first. It actually can be centered around a whole variety of potential other factors, some of which are outlined here, right? So it could be most restricted mobility, who has the longest commutes, highest transportation cost burden. These are all other sorts of ways of thinking about how you want to center your program. And regardless of what you choose, you really want to think about what are the key barriers, right? So some of the key barriers might be cost and financial, such as lacking a credit card or a bank account or good credit. Examples of physical access or use barriers might be that needs are different for seniors or for parents who are transporting young children or for people with disabilities. So we're just really thinking about, that you're not, by thinking about eligibility, that you're not sort of inadvertently doing anything else negative to preclude who is centered in the program. Another example is if you think about technology barriers, does the program rely on the use of a smartphone or the internet? Or does the range of an electric vehicle limit its effectiveness for people who have to commute very far? All of these types of factors might become inadvertent eligibility criteria if you're not sort of aware of those factors at the outset in the design phase. So just taking that all into account as you're thinking about defining eligibility and taking a sort of scaled or ramped approach is really that targeted universalism approach, where you might pick a particular group first to target, but then sort of thinking in terms of concentric circles and how can you provide perhaps slightly lower levels of support to others that are still affected, but perhaps slightly less affected. And I want to give a quick moment here as we're talking about eligibility back to Abhi to talk about, because on the next slide there it does outline a number of key factors that you can think about here, right, in terms of income, housing, transportation, demographics, energy affordability. And so Abhi, I think I will pass over to you to just briefly touch on the CUSP Energy Poverty and Equity Explorer tool to let participants really know how they can use this tool just for a moment and as they think about these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Farah. And so some of you might already be familiar, but CUSP has developed an energy poverty and equity mapping tool. Conveniently, it's on energypoverty.ca. If you go on there, you'll find the tool and you can launch it. So the tool has for a while had income, housing, demographics, transportation indicators for from a neighborhood scale all the way to a census division scale, and comparing that and cross-tabulating that against energy affordability, which is defined as households that pay more than twice the national average on home energy cost burdens. Now, the good news is that very recently, as of like 2 weeks ago, we have added, in addition to energy affordability, we've also added transportation affordability. So we have now the way, again, with all these geographic scales, you can go on the mapping tool and look at commute mode and distance. So households that are traveling more than 25 kilometers, commuting more than 25 kilometers to work. And so now, instead of treating energy poverty and affordability and transportation poverty and affordability as almost two different silos, now you can compare across them and really think about, like when Farah was talking about here earlier about, sorry, wrong direction, eligibility, is thinking about who has the longest commutes and how are they related to households that also have high energy cost burdens and so on. I'll hand it back to you now, Farah. Can I go over to the next slide? Oh, there it is. Yeah, the longest mode, medium distance modes. Yeah.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, Abhi. Great. So we just wanted to give you a quick preview there, but to bring us now to the next section around, as you're getting the program really kind of envisioned and then ultimately kind of structured, right? Who all do you want to be a part of the process? And so what we have here is just a few last slides from me before you can actually hear more in depth and bring these to life from some examples. These are really around program partners. And so we want to harken back to, I know that there was a previous webinar some months back that really touched more on coalition building, but we wanted to at least revisit this idea that very few clean energy programs, including electric vehicle programs, can be successful in general, let alone to be successful on the metric of all of the equity metrics that we could think of without having partnerships. Right? So building successful partnerships is a key to executing successful equity-oriented electric vehicles programs. So we've outlined here just some of the types of program partners that could be involved, and they can be playing a variety of functions around financial support, bringing resources, technical assistance, community outreach, and other. And these are really the types of program partners that you want to think about engaging. So community partners, whether that's neighborhood organizations, faith-based advocacy, or other types of local and community foundations, nonprofit partners, whether that's community development organizations, community action agencies, financial, a whole range, whether that's CDFIs or other types, governments, both local, state, neighboring municipalities, right? Don't forget about opportunities to partner nearby, and then technical partnerships, right? So that could be utilities or others. I think the kind of key piece here is really thinking about, as we turn into the next slide, is that different partners can play different roles. So as you think about who could be best positioned to administer the program, you really want to think about what the key needs are from the program and how to center equity. And then from there, it'll sort of be clear, or at least clearer, who is best positioned to be a program administrator. So some of the needs, right, might be, is it siting, is it coordinating permitting, is it community outreach, logistics, user interface? Really, what's the biggest need from a participant's perspective, and then who's best positioned to do that? Centering equity, really thinking about, regardless how who is the administrator, when you're actually pursuing a partnership and thinking about formalizing it, there's ways to really include equity directly into that process, into, for example, an RFP or selection process. So the city can ask its partners a direct line of questioning around, its internal structure or its engagement. So does the organization have a diversity and inclusion policy or goals for recruitment and retainment? What sorts of equity training does the partner have? How does the partner engage with target audiences in terms of program design and execution? Are the administrators' engagement practices and processes transparent and accessible and also iterative, right? So not just stopping at what's produced the first time, but responsive to community feedback. So these are the types of considerations to really think about as you bring equity to the forefront of even making what might seem like more logistical decisions around who a program administrator is. On the next slide around city government roles, really the evaluation that we just described can actually be applied to oneself as the city government, and think about evaluating your own and your colleagues' capacity and availability and existing history around being able to deliver on the items that we just described. And if it's determined that the city government is not sort of the right organization to be in the administrator role, think about what sort of other supporting roles a city government can play. So we have some of those listed here. It might be providing space for charging infrastructure. It might be, and I guess coming back to our equity focus, right, it might be particularly if there's opportunity for government-controlled siting near where target demographics might be located, such as affordable housing locations, but could be others. Program outreach can also be a nice opportunity to integrate with local government, particularly if you have existing programs from a housing sector or other sectors. Of course, you have to mind confidentiality, but are there ways to sort of leverage program outreach possibilities? And then similarly, providing other sorts of data and input depending on the specific program type. So I think these are what you want to consider internally for yourself as a city government. And then finally, in terms of recruiting key partners, on the last slide, we have listed a few of the core competencies that, again, may be somewhat held in-house at the local government, but maybe areas you want to supplement on, right? So community engagement, there might be partners that really have the experience and knowledge to facilitate the equitable program design on the ground, whether that's through language services, educational materials or outreach, or existing relationships. Technical assistance, there might be particular electric vehicles, charging equipment, logistical support, legal protection types of considerations that are just best provided through another partner. And then finally, there might be other partners that can provide certain types of financial support or resources. And so I'll just conclude with a very quick example, again, without getting into the details, but Cully Car Share in Portland, Oregon is an example in which an electric vehicle advocacy nonprofit called Ford partnered with an affordable housing nonprofit called Hacienda Community Development Corporation, and that CDC actually owned and managed residential buildings in a particular area and was able to play that outreach and supportive services role. And then they also, that duo had yet another partner that was more focused on providing the actual car sharing app. So again, that's just an example of bringing together different types of expertise to really center equity in delivering an equitable program, like thinking about what is actually needed and what roles each partner can play to make a successful and equitable program. So with that, that's kind of all the key concepts we wanted to walk through. I'm sure that a lot of this will come to life a bit more in the examples that my colleague Philip will provide here momentarily. But I did just want to take a very quick pause and see, are there any burning conceptual questions? And otherwise, I'm sure that it will be a bit clearer as we get into the examples. So any quick burning conceptual questions here?
Yeah, Farah, just a couple of quick notes as we jump into questions. So I think we can take a 5 to 10 minute pause here, not necessarily a quick one, just to bubble some questions up. And the second note is I wanted to clarify something I had said earlier regarding transportation data. So what we do have there are indicators. So we've calculated distance and mode. What we don't have yet is we don't have a metric for transportation poverty, so to speak. So we have some metrics on there that you can compare against energy poverty, but we're working on adding more transportation related affordability costs and burdens. So any questions from the audience, you can either vocalize it or type it in the chat if you so please, and we'll take about 5 or 10 minutes to take questions.
Hi there, this is Max from the city of Surrey. Can folks hear me?
Yes, Max.
Great. So just on Abhi's last comment there, I'm just wondering if Farah, or I'm sorry, I forgot the name of your colleague, if you know of any data out there, or even how we could try to understand transportation costs when we're thinking about that burden and its impact on equity, because we imagine here that it's likely higher than a lot of our home energy costs. And so we really want to try to consider that as we're moving forward with our strategy.
Sure, I can jump in and talk about that a little bit. This is Philip Krajcik, Farah's colleague at Cadmus, and I would say that Abhi is right on the right track when he's thinking about this. I think that the real important thing is to look at the combined burden of transportation and housing cost burdens, because there's a lot intertwined there. People tend to move further away from core cities because they may be priced out from the upfront costs of home ownership or from the price of rent, and so they may or may not be fully aware of the amount of trade-off they're having when they add transportation costs to the mix, and thinking about that not only in terms of the actual costs, but also the opportunity costs, lost time, and all those sorts of things. But in terms of actual data, I'd say that I have more familiarity of data sources in the US, and I could ask around with some colleagues to see if they have any data sources in Canada. But in the US, we have this National Household Transportation Survey that provides some pretty good information that really digs in deeply with groups in sort of each metro area. And there's obviously a whole bunch of census transportation planning package sort of material as well that helps you get at how many vehicle miles traveled people have to. And so even if you don't have that, if you don't have the direct cost data, you could sort of look at VMT data and think about look at vehicle registrations, what sort of fuel efficiency they have, and sort of back into some conclusions about costs. But I couldn't say whether you could get direct data or if you would need to back into it without digging in a little
Hey,
more. Does that help?
Max, this is Allison here. Max, if I can just add to what we're doing here for 2020, CUSP's data gap to be attacked is the transportation data gap, and so we've started with adding adding what we can from the census to the Explorer tool, which you can see right now just includes commute mode and distance, and we have a lot of different indicators within that which aren't yet on the tool. So within the next couple of weeks, you'll see a lot more metrics there. Right now, I think all we show are the percentage of households with really large commutes, more than 25 kilometers one way to work. And then also what the median commute is for a particular census tract. We have a lot more by specifically distance by specific mode, et cetera, that will all be getting up there in the next couple of weeks. That doesn't obviously tie to cost. And I will say that the first limitation, obviously, to that census data, which is all we've got available, is that it's commute to work only. So it does not include pleasure trips. It doesn't include commute to school. It even doesn't include people who commute to different places every day. So it's only if you're commuting to a regular location. To make it further conservative, it includes as the crow flies, not as you drive. So it's point to point, a straight line. So obviously it also understates the true distance of travel. But we're using it because it's what we've got, and presumably also commute to work is one of the areas where that's the most repetitive travel that somebody does. So it should be the easiest way for us to get them into other modes of transportation away from their private vehicle, and also to figure out why it is that people are needing to drive so far by private vehicle and what gaps there might be in transit connectivity and frequency. So we are going to work on the cost stuff. We can begin to, now that we have some commute distances, we can begin to impute some costs by adding fuel costs by province to start to imply what that transportation energy cost will be. But we would like to be looking more holistically at housing and transportation affordability. So recognizing that energy cost is one aspect of car ownership, the rest being maintenance and the actual cost of owning the car being far greater. We want to be looking kind of more holistically at transportation affordability and the cost of car ownership. In addition to sort of the energy cost burdens that are added to the total energy poverty that a household might be experiencing with their home energy bills, and then further amplified by their costs of transportation energy as well. So we are working on it, but the National Household Survey is far too insufficient in terms of its size of 15,000 households across the country to really give us very good transportation cost data. So we're gonna do our best to impute some cost data. We're gonna do our best to get some Google trip data from smartphones that they've been using for their Environmental Insights Explorer. And we're working with Transportation Canada to also see what more they have. So it's on our radar for this year, and we will do our best. But for now, we're going to have to kind of do some workarounds with this commute stuff and imputing some costs.
Allison, sorry, this is Eric from Non-City Cargo. I was just going to say it might be worth touching base with some of the municipalities, because I know we collect a lot of that type of data for doing our regional transportation modeling and have a continuous household activity survey going on. So a lot of the larger cities might have some good data that you could leverage. And just in terms of the fuel costs, I know one of the discoveries we had out of our data is that although the commute's probably the longest, most consistent trip, it still only accounts for about 25% of the travel activity people ever do on a day. So there's a lot of the non-commute activity making up a big part of what people are up to.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
This is Abhi jumping in. I wanted to add to that and say, on my part, I'm on the lookout for case studies of what cities in Canada have done to address some of these gaps, Max. So if there's ways that they have complemented, or fill in the gaps, doing some sort of sampling, surveying methodology locally. I haven't found many yet, but I'm on the lookout for that to address exactly the kind of gaps you're looking to fill. So as soon as I find out, I'll send it to you, Max, and then also to the broader group that it might be useful.
This is Glennis from Saanich. And I do know that the Capital Regional District, the CRD, is working on looking at the bundling affordability of housing and transportation. And sometimes it makes sense to try to put in some childcare costs into there as well to get a fuller picture for some types of families. So anyway, that's a resource that's going to be coming out soon. And informally, I've also been hearing from the community just some interesting points about equity that are not in this data, but about ability to choose other modes being limited for lower income people. So for instance, if you are working shift work and your shift ends or starts before bus service is available, or if you're somebody who needs to drive, like if you're doing one of the food delivery services, for instance, all of these things make it harder than commuting to work where you've got a government job with showers and a regular schedule and the buses run at peak times when you need to get places. So I thought that was some interesting other considerations too.
Thank you. Any other quick questions? Again, I should have mentioned this earlier, but as I'll flip it over to Philip to take us forward on the programmatic examples. But if you have questions, just type them in the chat, either to me or to the whole group, and we'll revisit them at the end of this session. Thanks, Philip. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to switch over to the next slide.
All right, great. Well, thanks for having me. Really excited to be part of this and appreciate the framing that you and Farah gave for my examples. I lead Cadmus's West Coast transportation electrification efforts. I focus on strategies for municipalities, fleets such as schools and transit agencies, and utilities. And of particular note, I've been doing a lot of work in California and have exposure to a wide range of activities out here, including evaluating the major utilities transportation electrification programs with substantial amounts of investment that's going on. So with our municipal clients, we strive to keep equity front and center in the visions and the resulting program designs. So I'm going to tell you about 3 different types of EV equity considerations. First, EV car sharing, then workforce programs, and then finally multifamily charging programs. So to start, there's a tremendous opportunity with EV car sharing. Transportation is really at the cusp of 3 revolutions right now: electrification, shared mobility, and autonomous vehicles. While autonomous vehicles have implications for equity as well, we've actually focused our research primarily on the equity implications of EV car share, since electrification and shared mobility have the potential to drop the fueling cost per mile and also extend the benefits of vehicle access to those who cannot afford the financial burden of owning cars. And actually, to Gwyneth's point, that's another piece that really comes up quite often, is the fact that sometimes people of limited means are sort of trapped or forced into fewer choices and may have to be driving cars no matter what. So looking at the cost is very important. So if you're also looking to reduce reliance on single occupant vehicles, car share is a good EV strategy because it can complement transit and has been shown to lead to a lower rate of car ownership. There are 2 major types, round trip and one way. One way can include subtypes such as station-based and where you have to drop it off at a specific location, and free floating, where you could drop off a car anywhere within a geographic area. As you might guess, free floating poses more substantial challenges when a car share uses EVs, since charging is not ubiquitous. So on the next slide, About a year ago, for a US Department of Energy project, we did a scan of equity-focused EV car share programs around the country, and we looked at design factors and implementation models that were being incorporated in these early programs. Here are some of the highlighted findings going from left to right across the slide. For context and design, the largest barriers were community skepticism, securing funding and partners, and the high upfront cost and complexity of launching such a program. These are particularly challenging due to the focus on customers without substantial disposable income to pay for the services. And also electrification requires more partnerships and higher upfront expense. So these barriers can be addressed by carefully matching the service, and I'll be on this slide for a little while, carefully matching the service to known needs. For instance, we looked at programs focused on rural farm workers without driver's licenses, seniors who needed help getting around, programs that provided rides to people to and from criminal justice appointments, and van pools as some of the more unique programs out there that provided interesting models. And so I say this to point out that a compelling narrative and a really well-tailored design can help with grant funding, which is really how you might expect to get one of these programs off the ground. So what I would recommend is you would start by brainstorming with community-based organizations to help you determine your design parameters, and ask questions like, who are the unbanked in your community? Who are the linguistically isolated people? How can we design a system with flexible means of reserving and accessing vehicles? So to move on to the next column, eligibility, a big question is whether to allow for general access to the service and whether that will help or hinder your goal of extending services to the target communities. Additional users not part of the target audience can provide base revenue that will help sustain the program, but that may mean that the service is less reliably available for those that you're particularly interested in helping. And then for partnerships, a major decision is whether the project should be run by a private company or as its own nonprofit. And in this case, you're trading control for experience and financial resources. For instance, a big question is liability insurance, and it's particularly an issue for nonprofit community car shares. So while a big operator with a large network of users and a lot of revenue can effectively self-insure, a single liability event, as you might imagine for a nonprofit running a small program, could be catastrophic. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how these look in the real world. So the first one I'll talk about is Blue LA in the Los Angeles area. Some of its strengths include that they put a substantial effort in tailoring the program to assuage fears of gentrification and to also meet community needs. They recruited local youth into a street team to promote the service, and they set up their pricing so that it was very favorable for people who are income qualified, particularly the monthly membership fee. And then they also went to some took efforts to make it accessible to unbanked customers, and also created multilingual kiosks for helping with reservations. Some of the biggest challenges they faced were user comfort and perceptions of safety. They had some graffiti instances, and cars ended up being relatively dirty, and some of the users reported fearing that they would be a vulnerable target when dropping the car off because they were in some of the rougher neighborhoods in Los Angeles. An interesting lesson learned here was actually that it's possible to gain negotiation leverage from the private company that's partnering, particularly if they have a desire to get a broader concession to run car share throughout the city. So this one, for example, is run through Bolloré Group out of France, and they were willing to put in all these efforts and to work very substantially with the local partners to design all those favorable elements that we just talked about. So the next example, Buffalo Car Share, not strictly an EV car share, but they did use greener vehicles, started back in 2009. And it was really a highly beloved program that ran for 6 years and was used for over 1 million miles. But here I included actually is, the reason I included is even successful and popular services are vulnerable to challenging state policy environments. So in this case, New York's insurance laws made it difficult for them to keep operating. So when they did close, they needed to get taken over by Zipcar. My conversation with those involved indicated that over time, the original users of the program let their subscriptions lapse, and that Zipcar changed the locations of the cars in the end as a result. So in the end, it was no longer as strongly focused on the core community needs as it had been. The final example I wanted to share was our community car share out of Sacramento, California. Some of its strengths include that it started modest with a strong focus on individual multifamily affordable housing buildings. And they had multiple vehicles in each pod so that they could maximize availability. They didn't try to cover a giant network. They really just sort of focused in on those places. They also offered service for free, subject to time limits, so that they wouldn't have to worry at all about barriers to join the program and participate. And what resulted from that was that it was immediately popular, and they had utilization greater than 30% even in the first phase right after launching. One interesting lesson here was that they were not just tracking utilization, but they were also surveying a lot of their users, and they found that they needed to get creative with metrics of success to capture the full picture. In this case, community volunteers were renting the cars more often actually to drive other people around, getting them to medical appointments, for instance, or job interviews and more. And so that sort of benefit wasn't obviously being captured by looking at the number of unique users. So just a parting thought on car share is that it is pretty complex to get started. There's a lot of partners involved, and we will send some follow-up resources afterwards. There's a directory of clean mobility partners, providers that's just been published recently that should cover most of them that would operate in North America and could be a good start for brainstorming how you might get started. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about another major consideration for EV deployment, the impact on low-skilled workers. So as you know, there's fewer moving parts in EVs, and so there's going to be fewer oil changes and other sorts of operations that conventional mechanics would be needed to perform. So one of our clients was really particularly concerned about this and thinking about the fact that they're starting to see quite high EV sales shares, and they wanted to develop a program to plan to upskill the workforce, both on the mechanics side and on the electrician side, to be prepared for electric vehicles. And this example is from Contra Costa County in the Bay Area. So for context design on the left side of the slide, the key is to create a curriculum and a program that community colleges and adult education partners are excited to contribute to, and that will also attract sufficient demand from mechanics. Start by asking, who are the people who need the training? What do they need? Will it be different for mechanics who work at, say, municipal shops, independent shops, dealerships, and other fleet settings? And so then in terms of offering the course, you're going to need to think about the frequency, locations, trying to get trainers and shop space and vehicles. So in the middle, determining the target audience, the two main questions are whether you want to cover both mechanics and electricians, and whether you want to target it at current enrollees in broader programs, such as a local technical school for mechanics, or if you'd want to focus on upskilling people already in the workforce. And my opinion here is that the best case is if you already have a willing partner with a cohort of students, so you can sort of do this incrementally and add additional courses and piggyback off the infrastructure they already have. Regarding the demand for the courses, it's important to note that some mechanics will see opportunity while others will be relatively set in their ways. And an opportunity here is to work with regional and state or province level governments to create carrots to entice participation. Contra Costa was looking at requiring a specific type of EV infrastructure training on government jobs for installing the charging stations, and also looking at facilitating access to employers and jobs for the trainees who had taken certain courses. So next slide. Just in terms of one of the neat things about Contra Costa, and I didn't get to insert a picture, but we had recently found that after we developed this plan, one of the local companies that's been working at their autonomous vehicle test bed donated a prototype vehicle that the local high school could use for disassembly and reassembly when they line up a qualified instructor. So it's something that's moving and they're really excited about it. And I would say this really is the sort of activity that can be pursued within most metro regions, whether or not you have any of those cutting edge companies that would donate vehicles. Even if you just get access to, say, an old hybrid, your students could get many of the same lessons that they would from a newer EV. And then finally, there's just a wealth of collaborators that are likely at your fingertips, looking not just within the city, but also regionally. Are there county or workforce development boards or other levels of government that are involved? What can the OEMs do in terms of providing training, and how are the unions interested in getting involved, and so forth. So next slide. The third topic I'll be addressing is expanding EV access to residents of multi-unit residential buildings. I hear that MERB is a common acronym in Canada. I hope that it does communicate that to you. But,
Yep.
You'll need to overcome many barriers here, such as renters don't often have the ability, let alone the motivation, to install EV charging in their residences. They may be shorter term or have plenty of other considerations. Then if they don't have their own charging, public charging can often be very expensive. And finally, there's significant logistical complexity to owning an EV as a renter. And if any of you are renters, I'm sure that rings true. So the goal here is really enabling charging at or near home or at or near work, so that EV usage is as seamless as regular car ownership. And this is a little bit of a catch-all category. There's really many different types of activities to do to close that charging gap in MERBs. It could range from doing zoning bylaw updates to pursuing EV-ready building code, right to charge laws, outreach, and things like that. So some of the increasingly popular approaches include mandating a certain percentage of spots in new MERB construction that are EV ready, and there's different thresholds that I can talk about afterwards if you'd like. Alternatively, addressing parking rules in the zoning ordinance gives you more control over, particularly over where you're mandating or incenting charging, which I think is important. If there's a parking minimum in place, giving credit for multiple spots for every EV capable spot is something that's been used to much success in places like Sacramento. And then if there's a parking maximum, perhaps you could provide allowances for EV car share or sort of exceptions to that rule whenever there's EV charging installed. And then exactions, of course, and development incentives are also options to think about when thinking about tools you have at your disposal. So next slide.
Philip, I want to pause here for a quick second, because I know that the MERB access is something that our cities are thinking a lot about. But I'm also a little conscious of time. I want to give Nadine a good chunk of time to cover their portion of the case study. I wanted to open this up, if you're okay with this, Philip, to questions from folks listening in. Do you have specific questions around integrating equity around multi-residential? I know some cities that I have talked to were looking specifically into this. While we have expert on the call here, is there any things that we would like to ask them?
Hi, it's Ian Neville from City of Vancouver. Actually, I was wondering if I could ask a question about the car sharing piece, or should we leave that until the end?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, so Philip, thanks for that. We're definitely working quite a lot on how to integrate more car sharing or electrify car sharing in Vancouver. And one of the things that was flagged for me on an equity basis early on was that a lot of low and medium income households are very reliant on having a vehicle like at a given time, whether they're doing shift work or whether they're working multiple jobs, and that car sharing might not have been a great fit for a lot of those scenarios. In your research, have you come across any sort of ways to ensure better reliability? Is it just having like a much larger fleet? Are there any other tactics that we could look at to ensure that people can truly depend on a car share vehicle like minute to minute?
I think one of the big considerations around that is making vehicles reservable. And if it's sort of a regular need where, say, someone needs a vehicle 5 or 6 days a week at a specific time, you might want to think about the fairness about that person sort of monopolizing that community resource. So you would need to think about that. But if you're thinking about, say, less common needs where someone knows they're always going to need 9 a.m. on Mondays or something like that, then I feel like a number of the places that we interviewed, they did indicate that they had implemented systems to ensure that there was access at specific times. And I can sort of dig back into my notes about which of them they were. I think another piece is that many of the car shares actually took the form of like van pools, and would, and this may or may not get to specific users' needs, but it could get to a number of users' needs if you have sort of a dedicated person who is volunteering to drive the vehicle at certain times of day, and it's known that it's going to essentially kind of be a type of almost micro transit, like you might see in other countries where you have sort of expected routes and expected times that serve only a few people, but important needs. So I'll have to punt a little bit on that, but I'd love to correspond a little bit more and share some contacts who have been doing stuff like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, that's definitely helpful. I appreciate it.
Philip, this is Allison here, and I live in Victoria, British Columbia, and this is kind of anecdotal, but our car share co-op here was pretty excited when they introduced 2 electric vehicles into their fleet of about 30 cars, but then they found that they are actually the least likely to be used or reserved because people had a fear of there not being an adequate charge when they came to use the vehicle. They might reserve it a week in advance, but then they don't know if it's going to come back 2 minutes earlier with 0 charge. What are you seeing people in the States doing to manage that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know if any of the examples I cited actually have mixed. I think they're all the examples that I talked about were exclusively EV, and so that sort of gets around that preference issue. But I definitely, that is an issue that's come up, and I think a lot of it comes down to how you set expectations for the use of the program, and also how you interface with and ensure that you specify in your agreement with the EVSP, the service provider, for the charging, specify that that information could be available so that if you do make a reservation, you could have information about what the state of charge is. But I think a lot of it comes down to that sort of information, having backup cars available nearby, and doing a fair amount of outreach and helping people understand that a lot of the cars will have a pretty substantial amount of range. And I feel like the way most people use car shares, and there's probably data on this, is not that they like take a long trip up into the mountains or something, but they're probably like using it for day-to-day, you know, getting groceries or going to medical appointments and whatnot. And as such, hopefully the range would be less of an issue. But
any other questions before we turn it over to Nadine? Seeing none, Philip, if it's okay with you, we'll move on, and you'll be around if there are questions that come up in the later discussion, right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you so much. This is Nadine and Philip's contact information. I will send this out as well, along with the rest of the notes. And if you have any questions for either of them, you can also reach out to me or Allison, and we'll make sure we'll get your questions answered by these experts. So now moving on to the case study of the Toronto vehicle EV strategy. We are very, very, very thankful for Nadine to come here and share with us some of her expertise in the process that the City of Toronto went through to really center equity in some of the EV work they've done. Something that I liked a lot was how they came up with KPIs around EVs. And so I'll let Nadine walk us through the process at City of Toronto. Nadine, you have the floor.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, cool. So I'm Nadine El Haj. I work with the Environment and Energy Division as a project lead. And under the leadership of our division, in consultation with consultants, the city's EV working group, the public and several stakeholders, a broad cross-section of stakeholders, I should say, we co-created the strategy together. The strategy was approved by Council on January 29th, and right now we're moving to the implementation phase. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on how we centered equity rather than providing you with an overview of the strategy. So the EV, for some background, the EV strategy comes out of our Climate Action Plan Transform TO, with a goal to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 or sooner. We move to the next slide. Abby? Thanks.
Yep,
so, yeah, we've been also directed by Council to think about our programs and any set of new policies that we make in a set of guiding principles that advance social equity, protect low-income residents, improve affordability, enhance and strengthen our local economy, maintain and create good quality jobs, improve public health, contribute to poverty reduction, and create resilient communities. So off to the next slide. So the approach, that, can you click again? Yeah, thanks. So the approach that we've taken to develop the strategy is, in addition to ensuring alignment with other city initiatives currently underway, we took a collective approach centering with a focus on equity. It was a collaborative effort with residents, multiple stakeholders, and the city's EV working group. And we recognize that the city can play a key role in promoting equitable access and affordability for electric transportation options. So a focus was placed on the considerations during the stakeholder workshops, public engagement sessions, and public survey. In addition to internal stakeholders, external stakeholders included academic, nonprofit, environmental advocacy groups, oil and gas, property developers, community groups, and the general public. The strategy will be adaptive to align with future technologies. We revisit the strategy every 4 years with a comprehensive review. And while the focus of the strategy is on the electrification of personal vehicles, we did also develop a mobility hierarchy that places a priority for walking, cycling, transit, and shared mobility. So in Transform TO, we actually have two transportation-related goals. One is that by 2050, 75% of trips under 5 kilometers will either be walked or cycled. And the other transportation goal is that by 2050 or sooner, 100% of transportation will use zero carbon energy. So off to the next slide, please. We also undertook, so part of the equity consideration is a mapping study that we undertook. The additional mapping includes also levels of EV adoption across the city, publicly accessible charging infrastructure. And the reason why we did that is to overlap all of these mapping layers and identify gaps where underserved communities are not served or do not have access to electric mobility. So some of the goals, so ultimately it was to determine which Toronto neighborhoods were at risk of being left behind on electric mobility. The goals of that mapping exercise was to ensure and consult on potential electric mobility actions, to provide access to electric mobility options, and not disproportionately subject marginalized communities to negative impacts of transportation. So if we can move to the next slide, please. The other thing, so in addition to a mapping exercise, can you click again? And again, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. In addition to the mapping exercise, when we did our stakeholder engagements and workshops, we asked stakeholders and the public to prioritize actions based on impact and feasibility. The impact is with relation to equity, resilience, economic development, health and noise, and the feasibility is what is the ease of implementation of those actions. So we came with them with, I think, a list of over 40 actions. And we tried, so after the first assessment, the list became a little bit shorter. Then second assessment was assessing the remaining actions from an equity perspective, identifying what are the blockers and enablers, and what are the measures on action impact. So for those shortlisted actions that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, we also tried to quantify what we thought the impact would be on GHG emissions, health, economy, and equity. So this was a qualitative exercise that we took with our stakeholders. 3 things that I'd like to highlight from our short list of actions is that although not a focus of the strategy, which is, as I mentioned, it was mainly centered around transitioning passenger vehicles to low carbon, through consultation, we identified a need to increase access and to provide actions around shared mobility. And shared mobility includes both car sharing mobility, so introducing EVs in car sharing programs and prioritizing perhaps specific neighborhoods that we will identify through a mapping exercise, but also micro mobility and the options such as e-bikes and e-scooters, which are being considered, e-scooters are being considered through a separate file as well. The other thing that I want to highlight is as a result of our consultation and as a result of TTC, our transit corporation, being a member of our EV working group, we also identified an opportunity to increase access to e-mobility through potentially integrating an equity lens on how TTC prioritizes routing selection criteria. So part of their selection is regarding the length of a trip and how it will be an e-bus will be serviced by their charging infrastructure. And another consideration might be equity and prioritizing neighborhoods that have challenges accessing e-mobility. Also on education and awareness, and as part of that work, we're addressing misinformation and informing public and residents about the total cost of ownership of EVs, identifying incentive programs that they can tap into, and identifying a used vehicle market, which very few people we realized are aware of. So I think for the next slide, please. So our next steps include identifying, so Transportation Services has identified a need to develop an equity-focused toolkit focused specifically on transportation programs. So this is currently underway or being explored at least. From our side, we'll continue to apply an equity lens as we implement the strategy. In 2020, we're going to be undertaking a study to identify public charging locations. We're going to be working with partners or identifying partnerships that we can work with to expand the public charging infrastructure. And we're going to initiate an education and awareness initiative. And we're reporting back with the outcome of the activity exploration identified in the EV strategy through an EV strategy status update report and developing business cases for activity implementation to be presented through the 2021 budget process. So this is briefly what we did on equity and how we centered equity through our work on the EV strategy.
Nadine, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. That was fantastic. Before I turn it over to questions, I wanted to invite Ian from Vancouver and Eric from Calgary, if you wanted to weigh in on some of your experiences around designing for equity on your EV or car sharing programs. Did you folks want to weigh in really quick?
Sure, I can. it was okay with Eric, I'll go first. And so we have a few things. So our strategy was developed a few years ago, and so equity was really just starting to become a sort of top of mind consideration in bringing this forward. So I don't know that the level of design that we have is quite as thorough as what Toronto has done, but we have done a few things around sort of trying to make electric vehicles as equitable as possible. Probably the first thing is actually what we've done around EV readiness in new buildings. So we've had requirements in place since about 2011 for buildings to be EV ready in some capacity, including multifamily. But as of 2018, we've actually brought that to be 100% of new parking stalls being EV ready, which was largely done on it with an equity focus. The idea being that you're not forcing future buyers, i.e. those who are looking to wait for an established used market or for cost of vehicle ownership to come down. We don't want those ones to be saddled with retrofit costs. So really focusing on that 100% EV readiness has been a big deal for us. And as well, enforcing that through a standards of maintenance bylaw that we have that basically says, if you have electric vehicle infrastructure or a lot of other infrastructure as well, but we've also included electric vehicle infrastructure. If it's in place, then it's expected that it would be used and accessible for its intended purpose. It's not quite as strong as a right to charge rule that we're hoping the province brings in here in British Columbia, which would basically obligate stratas or condo boards, which is what they're called everywhere, but here it would obligate them to at least consider putting in EV charging and sets out boundaries around who's responsible for what costs. We also have a number of EV car share requirements. So we've had car sharing requirements in new buildings for some time. We've allowed developers to eliminate up to 5 parking stalls in a parkade if they're including car sharing. And those have now been changed to, or I guess they're in the process of being changed so that those car share vehicles actually need to be electrified. It's actually been a really successful program. About five parking stalls in Vancouver cost about $250,000. So switching over to any car share vehicle, but certainly an electric, has been quite popular with developers. I'll try not to take too long here, but just some other things that we have done outside of building construction. Our public charging network is really focused on supporting people who don't have access to home charging. I know Philip cited one of the challenges being that public charging does tend to be a bit more expensive, and that's something we're still working through. But when it comes to siting charging infrastructure, really looking to prioritize neighborhoods that have higher proportions of renters, higher proportions of people who may not have access to off-street parking. And also really trying to make sure that the city-owned public charging infrastructure is not going in areas where the private sector may be colonizing it already. So really, we're looking for the bad business cases and putting our infrastructure there. But the idea being that at least that access will be more available for people who are possibly more reliant on it. And then, oh, sorry. Sounded like someone was trying to chime in there. Oh, okay, I'll keep going. The other thing we're doing to back up the public charging network, we do have a big focus on fast charging. However, recognizing that to build a fast charging network that would support all of the drivers that would need public charging in Vancouver is probably overly onerous. We're looking at what's called a neighborhood charging strategy now to complement that. Really providing near home charging that's at lower powers to provide people with overnight access to charging if they don't have reasonable access to off-street parking or off-street charging. So those may be people who live in basement suites. They may be people who live in neighborhoods that don't have access to off-street parking at all. So we're really kind of working through that now, and that is probably going to be a combination of trying at some light pole charging and using our light pole network, but also working with faith groups and schools to get like level 1 charging installed in those kind of underutilized parking areas for overnight access. So that's something we're kind of working through right now as part of our climate emergency response.
Thanks, and then sorry to cut you in, but I wanted to pull in Eric and also Kevin from Halifax. If you're on the call, Eric, maybe you go first, and then I'll call on Kevin to add to what Ian talked about.
Sure. Well, the real quick version would be ditto. I think certainly for Calgary, we've certainly been learning a lot from what we've been seeing in Ontario and Quebec in terms of practices. So 3 key things we're working on right now related to equity. One is we're partnering with the City of Edmonton and just finalizing a study on what home and workplace EV requirements should be in terms of EV ready and EV capable requirements. So similar to what Ian and I think Nadine Duguay had talked about there. Also looking at the concept of community charging hubs, partly thinking again in terms of locations that would be difficult for someone to retrofit and therefore have access in an existing apartment or condo building, but also wanting to look at, can we combine the concept of EV charging hubs with the broader concept of a mobility community hub where you could actually bring in EV charging, linked to transit, scooters, micromobility, so where you're physically creating that access to a lot of options and also developing a mobility as a service digital platform to connect people with all of those options. And then quickly on the car share piece, one of the things we just got approved as a change to our policies was to provide a 50% discount on all the parking fees for car share companies that are using fully electric vehicles in their fleet. I don't know if anyone can take us up on that right away because they said it's tough to get fleet discounts on EVs in Canada. There's such a high demand relative to the supply. But certainly we're trying to send that signal, again, to provide another option for people who maybe can't afford to buy an EV to still have access to it. So those are 3 of the big pieces we're looking at right now.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it. Kevin, I know you folks are just getting started. Do you have any early lessons you might want to share really quick with us?
Yeah, so as Abby said, we are just getting started. Our tender for a municipal EV strategy closed on Friday, so we're looking forward to digging into that stuff. We do want to focus on the equity piece. Some of the things, as Eric mentioned, would be creating those charging hubs or seeing what type of model could work for our garage orphans in the high density areas. Also, we're looking to transition a lot of our light duty fleet vehicles, so we see an option of potentially doing a car share for the off hours, as Halifax is quite well, HRM is large geographically. A lot of people do rely on driving and transit to get around, so we think that might be beneficial for that to get around, or even that last mile. Also, Mahone Bay, a town that's just south of us, they actually just released an EOI for an electric car share. So we're going to be working with those folks to see what they get back from that. So yeah, we're pretty early, as Abby said, but we're looking forward to taking these lessons and hopefully answering the call.
Thanks, Kevin. It's officially time, so I apologize for going a little over, and there's a lot of interest in here, so we can keep the meeting going. If you have questions, for those who are able to stay, and I know time is tight and we're already starting to lose a few people, so if you'd like to stay on the call for just a little bit longer, we'll be open for questions. But officially our call is ended. We'll send the recording out. You feel free to share it with your colleagues who may not have been able to join us today. Thanks a lot, everyone, for being here. More so our Cadmus team and Nadine and folks who jumped in on the call with us towards the end. Thanks, and again, we might stay on. Those of us who would like to stay on, the call will keep going. But thanks everyone for being here.